An ancient king makes a choice that will change the world forever. The shadow of Sauron spreads from the land of Mordor, a darkness so vast it threatens to consume everything. In this desperate hour, High King Gil-galad of the Elves stands before his council. His decision is already made. He will swallow centuries of elven pride and seek an alliance with the race of men. He dispatches his most trusted herald on a perilous mission, a gamble that risks everything. By the end of our story, you will understand the true cost of unity and the sacrifice required to stand against the night. What ancient grudge must be set aside to face a common enemy? Where are you listening from right now? And what is the hour in your corner of the world? The fate of Middle-earth now rests on the success of a single, fragile alliance. Lord Elrond rode east, as if the very wind were at his back, the banner of Gil-galad, a silver flame against the deepening gloom. His journey was a descent into a waking nightmare. The farther he traveled from the fair lands of the elves, the more the world sickened around him. Forests that should have been green and vibrant stood leafless and gray, their branches like twisted bones. A foul miasma clung to the air, and the streams he passed ran with a thin, oily film. This was the creeping blight of Sauron, a poison seeping from the dark land of Mordor and corrupting the very earth. Each sign of this decay only hardened Elrond's resolve, turning his diplomatic mission into a desperate race against an encroaching shadow. His path led him into the treacherous mountains, through passes haunted by things that shun the sun. Whispers echoed from the stone, and pale, scuttling shapes moved just beyond the edge of sight. The tension was a physical weight, the sense of being watched never relenting. It was here he faced a fateful choice: to take a safer, longer route or to brave the shortcut through the Valley of Gorgoroth, a place so cursed that even the moonlight seemed to die there. With the fate of Middle-earth hanging in the balance, he chose the valley. He urged his horse forward into the oppressive darkness, a solitary figure of light, defying the overwhelming dread. That decision, to press on through such palpable evil, revealed the depth of his commitment. The enemy's reach was far greater than the elves had feared. When he finally emerged from the mountains, the sight that greeted him was worse than any shadowy terror. The eastern horizon was stained with thick, black smoke. Not the gentle plume of a hearth fire, but the great, choking columns of burning settlements. Sauron's war was already here, and the fledgling kingdoms of men were being consumed by its flames. The thunder of war machines shook the very stones of Annúminas. Upon the high walls, standing tall amidst a hail of black arrows, King Elendil rallied his weary troops. His command was not a whisper of hope, but a roar of defiance, a direct challenge to the dark lieutenant commanding the siege below. He knew the cost. To hold the line here, against such overwhelming force, was to spend the lives of his people like water, but he also knew the value of the time that sacrifice would buy. Inside his halls, his council pleaded with him. They urged a strategic retreat to the stronger, ancient holds in the mountains, to fight another day from a place of safety. Yet Elendil's heart and his vision would not allow it. He saw not just the fall of a single city, but the extinction of all hope if they fled now. His decision to stand and fight, driven by a belief in a greater alliance yet unseen, forged a profound loyalty in his sons, Isildur and Annúminas. They stood with him, their own fates now irrevocably tied to his own. In that moment, the king was risking more than his city or his crown. He was risking his entire lineage, the future of his house, on the strength of a promise not yet fulfilled. As the great battering ram slammed against the main gate, and the air grew thick with smoke and despair, a new sound pierced the chaos, clear and pure, cutting through the din of battle like a shaft of sunlight through storm clouds, came the call of a lone elven horn. That lone elven horn was not a dream, it was the sound of salvation. Elrond rode through the shattered gate, not as a distant diplomat, but as a warrior, his blade already stained from the horrors of his journey. He was brought not to a throne room, but to the heart of the city's defense, a courtyard of stone scarred by fire and blood. There, standing amidst his captains and the grim-faced survivors, was King Elendil. The air was thick with more than smoke. It was heavy with the memory of ancient grievances, of old wars between elf and man that these very stones seemed to remember. Elrond's plea was one of pure logic and desperate need. He spoke of Gil-galad's host gathering in the west, of a combined strength that could break the siege of Mordor itself, of a chance to end the shadow for all ages. But logic often falters against the weight of old pain. Murmurs of distrust rippled through the men. One captain, his face a mask of fresh grief, stepped forward. "We bled while you waited in your hidden cities," he accused. "What is this alliance but a means for elves to let men die in their place?" The tension snapped. A blade was drawn not in challenge, but from the shadows, a dagger aimed for the grieving captain's back. Elrond moved with a speed that seemed to bend time itself. There was no speech, only action. His own sword met the assassin's strike in a shower of sparks, his body a shield. The brief, violent struggle ended with the traitor disarmed and subdued. In that single, selfless act, centuries of eloquent argument were rendered meaningless. He had not come to talk while they died. He had come to fight alongside them. The mood in the courtyard shifted palpably, the suspicion in the eyes of the men softening into a hard, earned respect. Elendil watched it all, his own heart a battlefield of duty and doubt. To embrace this elf, to tie the fate of his wounded kingdom to an ancient and powerful race, was a risk that could shatter his authority. Some would see it as weakness, as begging for salvation. He looked from Elrond's determined face to the hopeful, desperate faces of his own people. The safe path was to retreat and preserve what was left. The kingly path was to dare a greater hope. His decision was made. He would hear the formal proposal, and he would swear his kingdom to this alliance. That night, under a canopy of stars that had witnessed the dawn of both their races, a pact was sworn. It was not a treaty of grand celebration, but a solemn vow between two leaders who understood the terrible price they might yet pay. It was a fragile thread of hope, spun from trust earned in blood, stretching across a continent into the gathering twilight. The Plains of Iriador were a vast, windswept stage for history. Here, beneath an open sky, High King Gil-galad and King Elendil met face to face. Their handshake was not a mere greeting. It was the final, irrevocable lock of an oath, a gesture that committed their entire armies to a single, shared purpose. Almost immediately, the friction began. The camp that rose from the neutral ground, was a chaotic tapestry of two alien cultures forced into one space. The elegant, fluid drills of the elven archers, their movements a silent and precise dance, were constantly disrupted by the thunderous, earth-shaking maneuvers of human heavy infantry. The air grew thick with muttered grievances. Elven captains complained of the noise and clumsiness of men. Human commanders scoffed at what they saw as elven arrogance and impracticality. This was the first true test of the alliance, and it was failing on the training field. Gil-galad and Elendil watched from a ridge, the tension between their people a palpable force. They knew that to command a united army, they first had to command the respect of their own ranks. The solution came not from a council, but from a personal risk. Gil-galad, in a move that stunned his own guard, descended from his post and walked directly into the human training area. He did not call for their commander. Instead, he approached Elendil's son, Isildur, and requested a sparring match. The challenge hung in the air. This was no simple exercise. It was the prestige of the entire elven race placed squarely on the line against the raw strength and spirit of the heir to men. The two combatants circled each other, a study in contrasts. Isildur was powerful and direct, his great sword sweeping in forceful arcs. Gil-galad was grace and economy, his spear eglows a blur of controlled motion, deflecting and redirecting every attack. The match was not about victory, but about demonstration. When Gil-galad finally yielded the round, acknowledging Isildur's unbroken will, a new understanding was forged in the packed earth of the training ground. That single act of humility from a high king began to dissolve the walls of mistrust. That night, around the shared campfires, the conversation was different. The silence was less hostile, the glances less suspicious. A fragile, hard-won camaraderie began to kindle, a small flame of unity against the coming dark. It was in this moment of tentative hope that the scouts returned, their faces ashen. The enemy was not waiting. Sauron's strength was massing, a great shadow stirring in the east, and their time for preparation had just run out. That fragile flame of unity flickered in the harsh wind of reality. It began with a routine patrol along the jagged foothills, a mixed company of elves and men led by the human commander Odor. They were tracking a band of orc raiders, and Odor, a veteran of the northern marches, knew the land. He saw an opportunity to drive the enemy into a narrow canyon where they could be destroyed. But from the ridge above, the elven captain Phelan watched with mounting fury. To his eyes, Odor's maneuver was a brutish, headlong charge, a reckless gamble that exposed their flank. He did not wait for a signal. His voice, sharp with centuries of ingrained superiority, cut across the battlefield. "You lead them to a slaughter," he shouted at Odor. "Your haste will be the death of us all." The accusation, voiced in the heat of battle, shattered their coordination. The orcs, sensing the sudden discord, turned not into the canyon, but against their divided pursuers. In the confused skirmish that followed, several soldiers from both sides fell, wounded not just by orc blades, but by the poison of mistrust. The patrol returned to camp not in triumph, but in a sullen, angry silence, the wounded a stark testament to the failure. Word of the incident spread like a fever. The camp, once a place of tentative hope, became a tinderbox of accusation. Phelan stood defiant before the Joint War Council, his pride a cold shield. He did not deny his words. He defended them. He spoke of elven foresight and human impetuousness, framing the clash as a failure of human tactics, not his own insubordination. The alliance itself seemed to hang in the balance, its fate resting on the next words of the High King. Gil-galad listened, his face an unreadable mask of starlight and shadow. He could have offered a compromise, a shared reprimand to save face, but he knew that true unity could not be built on the fragile ground of political convenience. His voice, when it came, was quiet, yet it carried the weight of mountains. He turned not to the human commanders to apologize, but to his own captain. "Captain Phelan," he declared, "your loyalty to our people is known, but your actions today were a betrayal of our greater oath. You are stripped of your command." The silence that followed was absolute, more shocking than any outburst. For an elf to be so publicly humiliated by his own king was unheard of. The decision was a masterstroke of leadership that came at a terrible cost. It solidified Elendil's trust and silenced the doubters among men, proving the Elven King's commitment was absolute. But within the Elven encampment, a new and dangerous current began to flow. A faction of the older, more prideful elves saw the act not as justice, but as a profound humiliation, a capitulation to the short-lived race of men. Their resentment was a low, simmering fire, and their discontent did not go unnoticed. From the deep shadows between the supply tents, a figure observed it all. This was no elf or man, but a servant of a different master, his form cloaked and his eyes missing nothing. He watched the disgraced Phelan stalk away. He noted the hushed, angry conversations, and a thin, cruel smile touched his lips. The alliance had survived its first true test from without, but the seeds of discord, carefully noted, were now sown from within. Isildur remembered the sparring match, the intense focus in Gil-galad's eyes. Now, in the quiet of the night, a different memory surfaced, a flicker of movement in the High King's guard that had seemed out of place, a man whose gaze held a strange, vacant chill. It was a suspicion, nothing more, a thread of intuition in the dark. He chose to pull it. Under the cold light of the moon, the camp was a tapestry of deep shadows and silvered tents. Isildur moved like a ghost, his own breathing the only sound in his ears. The figure was there, a cloaked shape, slipping between the elven and human quarters with a predatory grace. This was no clumsy infiltrator. This was a hunter. The chase was a silent, deadly dance. They wove through lines of sleeping soldiers, past the proud banners of two races now united, the spy always a step ahead, always moving toward the command tents. Isildur closed the distance near the horse pens, the scent of hay and earth thick in the air. The spy spun around, a dull black dagger already in his hand. There were no words, no challenges. The fight was brutal and quiet, a contest of strength against a terrifying, unnatural speed. Isildur was a warrior of power and skill, but his opponent fought with a painless ferocity, as if the blade he wielded was an extension of a will that was not his own. It was in the struggle, as Isildur locked the man's arm, that he saw it, a sickly pale shard of metal embedded just below the spy's collarbone, pulsing with a faint, evil light. A Morgul blade. The realization struck him like a physical blow. This was not an enemy to be hated, but a victim to be pitied, a man whose mind and soul had been stolen and replaced with a puppet of shadow. The easy choice, the safe choice, was to drive his own sword home. But Isildur, in that moment, saw a deeper battle, one not against a man, but against the corruption that had made him. With a tremendous effort, he twisted the poisoned dagger away and slammed the hilt of his sword against the man's temple, catching his slumping body before it could hit the ground. The risk was immense. The prisoner was a weapon waiting to be triggered, but the potential knowledge was worth it. Bound and unconscious, the spy was dragged before the horrified kings. His ramblings were a tapestry of nightmare, whispers of a great host gathering in Mordor, a force so vast it would blacken the plains, and of other agents, other blades, already hidden within the ranks of the free peoples. The enemy was not just at the gates, he was already inside, and his greatest weapon was the corruption of the very hope that had brought them all together. The spy's ramblings echoed in the silence of the command tent, long after his voice had faded. His words painted a map of their own doom, a chilling portrait of an enemy force, growing stronger with every passing hour. The war council that gathered was not a place for boasting or bravado, but for the grim arithmetic of survival. Elrond stood, his finger stabbing down at the crude map, spread across the table, pointing directly at the narrow pass into Mordor, the Black Gate. "We must strike now," he urged, his voice low and intense. "Speed is our only ally. Every day we delay, his fortress of Barad-dûr grows taller, his legions more numerous. We must use the shock of our union, the very surprise of our assault, to break his will before it is fully formed." It was the way of the elves, a philosophy honed over millennia, to act with decisive grace, to cut the sickness out before it could fester. But King Elendil shook his head, his own face etched with the memory of the Siege of Anuminas. To march headlong into that desolation is to feed his armies with our own bodies, he countered, his tone heavy with the burden of lost men. We know the cost of his war machines, his trolls, his endless ranks of orcs. Let him break upon our shields. Let us build a fortress here, at the edge of his blight, and let his hatred dash itself against our walls until he has nothing left. This was the way of men, the hard-learned lesson of endurance, of outlasting a stronger foe through grit and fortification. The two strategies laid bare the very soul of their peoples, a conflict not of courage, but of time itself. The elves, with their long view of history, sought a swift, surgical end. The men, with their mortal lives, planned for a war of grinding attrition. All eyes turned to the High King. Gil-galad had listened to both, his gaze moving from Elrond's fiery conviction to Elendil's stolid resolve. The fate of the free world rested on a single choice, a decision that could either forge their alliance into unbreakable steel or shatter it into 1,000 petty fragments. He did not choose one plan over the other. He saw a third path, a braiding of their strengths into something entirely new. "We will do both," he declared, his voice cutting cleanly through the tension. "Elrond, you will have your swift strike. A vanguard of our fastest riders and keenest archers will race for the Black Gate, a spear point to test their defenses and draw their eye. But it will not be a suicide charge. King Elendil, your wisdom gives it purpose. The main host of the alliance, your heavy infantry and our spears combined, will follow as a moving fortress, a rear guard of such immense power that nothing Sauron sends against it will stand. The vanguard's speed creates the opportunity, the rear guard's strength turns that opportunity into victory. It was a breathtaking gamble, a masterstroke that demanded perfect trust and perfect timing. By merging their philosophies, he committed every last soldier, every ounce of their hope, to a single, decisive campaign. There would be no second chance, no retreat. The order went out, and the camp erupted into a controlled frenzy of preparation. The great host began its long march east, a river of steel and determination flowing toward the shadow, its two currents, one of swift light and one of implacable strength, moving as one toward a destiny none could truly foresee. The long march east was a trial by fire and dust. The green lands of Iriador gave way to a blighted plain, a vast expanse of cracked earth under a relentless, copper-hued sky. Supply wagons, the lifeline of any army, bogged down in the ashen soil, their wheels breaking under the strain. As rations dwindled, the first true cracks in the alliance began to show not as shouts, but as sullen silences. Elven warriors, sustained by their waybread, watched with growing unease as the human soldiers beside them weakened, their steps faltering from a hunger the elves themselves could not feel. It was a young elven scout, her face etched with pity, who first broke the unspoken rule. She offered a small, wrapped piece of her own lembas to a human soldier whose hands trembled too much to hold his spear steady. That single, quiet act rippled through the ranks. It was not an order from the kings, but a choice from the heart, a recognition of shared suffering. The waybread, a marvel of elven craft that could sustain a man for days, became more than food. It became a sacrament of their shared cause, a tangible proof that their fates were now irrevocably linked. Seeing this, King Elendil made a strategic decision that carried the weight of a father's hope. He moved his son Isildur's regiment to march directly alongside Elrond's own household guard. This was no mere tactical placement. It was a statement woven into the very fabric of their formation. The future King of Men would now live or die under the direct protection of the Elven Herald, and Elrond's people, in turn, would be shielded by the strength of Numenor. The fates of their houses, their very lineages, were now braided together, raising the stakes of every skirmish, every decision, to an almost unbearable height. And always on the eastern horizon, a terrible beacon called to them. The volcanic fires of Mount Doom stained the night a bloody red, its plumes of smoke and ash a constant reminder of the power they marched to challenge. The land itself was dying, and with every step, the air grew thicker, hotter, and harder to breathe, as if the shadow of Mordor was a physical weight pressing down upon their souls. The vast plain of Dagorlad was a flat, cracked nightmare under the bruised sky. Here, the Alliance deployed for the first time as a single army, a grand tapestry of silver and steel woven against the darkness of the Black Gate. But Sauron had chosen his ground with a malice that mocked their plans. The moment the human lines advanced, the very earth seemed to betray them. From hidden fissures and tunnels that scarred the plain, fresh waves of orcs poured forth, not to meet the front line, but to curl around its flanks like black pincers. The human formations, built for a head-on assault, began to buckle under the surprise attack from the sides. In that moment of crisis, centuries of elven military doctrine were cast aside. There was no time for elegant, defensive phalanxes. A raw, desperate roar went up from the elven ranks as their commanders, seeing the human lines about to be severed, gave the unthinkable order. They charged. It was not a coordinated maneuver, but a furious, headlong rush to plug the gaps, to throw their own bodies into the breach. The battle dissolved into 1,000 chaotic struggles, a swirling melee where the only strategy was survival. In the heart of this chaos, Isildur saw a patch of silver and blue surrounded by a tide of black iron. An elven banner bearer, the symbol of Gil-galad's house, was being cut off, his guard falling one by one. To lose that standard would be a shattering blow to morale, a victory for the shadow. The safe choice was to hold the line, to let the elven unit be sacrificed for the greater formation. But Isildur saw only a brother in arms about to be slaughtered. He did not ask for permission. He simply turned, raised his sword, and with a cry that was more a promise than a shout, led his own household guard in a reckless, driving wedge straight into the heart of the enemy encirclement. It was a madman's gamble, a move that risked his entire command and his own life. But that single, defiant act of solidarity turned the local tide. His charge broke the orcish ring, allowing the surviving elves to rally, the banner lifting high once more. As the sun set, its light filtering through the haze of smoke and ash, the first day of battle ended not in victory, but in a bloody, exhausted stalemate. The ground was littered with the mingled dead of both races, their blood soaking into the cursed soil together. There were no cheers, only the grim, shared understanding that had been forged in the fire of that desperate day. The survival of men had depended on the spontaneous sacrifice of the elves, and the honor of the elves had been redeemed by the courageous folly of a man. Their alliance was no longer a pact between kings, but a bond written in the blood of common soldiers. The air in the camp was thick with the scent of blood and healing herbs. King Elendil walked slowly through the rows of wounded men, his boots silent on the trampled earth. He paused by each pallet, his hand resting on a fevered brow or clasping a trembling hand, his presence a quiet anchor in a sea of pain. He saw the hollowed eyes of boys who would never see their fathers again, the grim endurance of veterans who knew this was only the beginning. Every gasp of agony, every still form under a blanket, was a weight upon his soul, a direct challenge to the choice he had made. He had brought them here, to this cursed plain, to die alongside allies who seemed to bear their own losses with a silent, eternal grace. The contrast was a sharp sting. While his men wept and cried out, the elves tended their wounded with a solemn, almost detached dignity. It was not a lack of feeling, he knew, but a different relationship to time and mortality. For his people, this was the end of a single, precious life. For the elves, it was a sorrow to be carried for millennia. In that moment, the Grand Alliance felt like a terrible bargain, a pact where men paid the dearest price. This doubt was a heavier burden than any crown. He could not let his men see it. Leaving the medical tents, he did not return to his own pavilion. Instead, he found himself walking toward the quiet, starlit hill where the banner of the High King stood. He found Gil-galad standing alone, his gaze fixed not on the camp, but on the distant, fiery eye of Mount Doom. Elendil did not speak of tactics or supply lines. His voice, when it came, was raw with a king's most private fear. "I look upon my sons," he said, "and I see the future of my house. I look upon my men, and I see the future of my kingdom. And I wonder if I have led them all to ruin for a dream." It was the ultimate vulnerability, a confession that could shatter the trust between them. Gil-galad did not offer empty comfort. He turned, his own face etched with a sorrow as deep as the oceans. "You speak of your sons, Elendil," he replied. "My people are my children, every one. And when one falls into darkness, a part of my own light is extinguished forever. We do not feel it less. We simply have longer to remember the pain. This war will mark my people for all the ages of this world, whether we win or lose." His words reframed the entire conflict. This was not a temporary struggle for men and a passing engagement for elves. It was an eternal scar upon both their peoples. In that shared understanding, under the cold, impartial stars, the alliance transformed. It was no longer a political necessity, but a shared burden, a vow between two fathers for the future of all their children. The resolve that settled between them was quieter than any oath and stronger than any fortress wall. They would see this through, whatever the price. The Siege of Barad-dûr stretched from seasons into years, a brutal war of attrition, fought under a sky forever stained with ash. The Dark Tower stood as a mockery of their efforts, its black stone unyielding, its foundations pulsing with a power that seemed to feed on their very despair. For the soldiers of the Alliance, life narrowed to a grim cycle of watchfulness and sudden, violent sorties against the enemy walls. The initial fire of their shared purpose cooled into the hard, cold ember of endurance, and a deep weariness settled into the bones of both elves and men. How do you maintain hope when the enemy you fight is not just an army, but a mountain itself? The psychological toll was a silent enemy, more insidious than any orc. Elven eyes, accustomed to the slow turning of ages, now witnessed the rapid decay of their human allies, saw friendships forged in battle, extinguished by the simple, cruel passage of time. Men, in turn, wrestled with the feeling that they were giving their single, fleeting lives to a struggle that, for their allies, was merely a long chapter in an immortal story. It was in this atmosphere of grinding fatigue that High King Gil-galad made a fateful choice. He summoned Elrond to his command tent, the air thick with the dust of the plain and the weight of 7 years of stalemate. The trust he placed in his herald was absolute. "I cannot be the anchor and the spear," Gil-galad told him, his voice quiet but firm. "The defense of our rear and the unity of our host demands my presence." But the siege, the relentless pressure on that tower, requires a mind that can see beyond the next assault. This is your command now. By elevating Elrond to the forefront of the siege operations, Gil-galad did more than delegate a task. He positioned the future of the elven people, their wisdom and their resilience, at the very tip of the spear aimed at Sauron's heart. The stakes for Elrond were now immense, his every decision scrutinized by both races, his failures or successes echoing through the ranks. He studied the endless, bloody reports, the maps scarred with failed approaches, and saw a pattern of futility. They were trying to chop down a tree by striking at its branches. A bold, desperate plan began to form in his mind, a gambit that would either break the deadlock or break the alliance forever. He proposed a feint, a massive, noisy assault on the main gate, designed to look like their final, all-or-nothing push. It would be a terrible, costly distraction, drawing every eye and every defender to the front. And in that chaos, a small, hand-picked team of the hardiest dwarven sappers and the most agile elven climbers would attempt the impossible, to tunnel through the foundation of the outer wall at its weakest point, a place where the sorcery of the tower seemed thinnest. It was a plan born of utter necessity, a final roll of the dice in a game that had already lasted too long. Deep beneath the war-torn plain, in a cavern sealed by silence and secrecy, a different kind of battle was being waged. This was the secret forge, a place of fire and hope, hidden from the enemy's gaze. Here, Elrond presided over a gathering that would have been unthinkable only years before. The greatest smiths of the elves stood shoulder to shoulder with the most skilled human artisans, their faces illuminated by the same sacred fire. The air hummed with more than heat, it hummed with the tension of shared mysteries. An elven master placed a sliver of a rare, starlit crystal into the hands of a human smith, explaining in hushed tones how to fold its light into the molten steel. A human craftsman, in turn, revealed the secrets of Númenórean tempering, a technique for drawing out a blade's resilience through precise cycles of fire and ice. With every shared secret, a new weapon was born, each one forged not just of metal, but of trust, each one imbued with a pure light meant to cut through the physical and spiritual darkness of Mordor. The risk was immense. Elrond knew that by revealing these closely guarded arts, he risked the wrath of traditionalists in his own camp, who saw such knowledge as the birthright of the elves alone, not to be shared with a race that would fade from the world. Yet the greater risk was inaction. The most controversial choice, however, was his decision to include Isildur. He did not invite the prince as an observer, but as a participant, guiding his hands to hold the tools, teaching him the simple, foundational chants that focused intent into the craft. This was more than strategy. It was an act of profound faith, a belief that the future of both their peoples was now intertwined. The bond forged over that anvil was stronger than any alloy, a silent understanding that passed between them with every strike of the hammer. And when the first of these new blades was finally quenched, its edge gleaming with a captured radiance that seemed to drink the shadows from the very air, they all knew. This was not merely a new weapon, it was a new kind of power, born from unity, a light that the shadow could never have foreseen. The rhythmic groan of the great siege engines was the heartbeat of the camp, a sound of relentless pressure against the dark tower. But on this night, a different sound cut through the gloom, the soft scrape of metal on metal where there should have been only silence. Odor, the human sentry whose own pride had once nearly shattered the alliance, now stood frozen in the shadow of a massive catapult, his hand tight on the hilt of his sword. He watched the figure move with an elven grace, but the intent was all wrong, a furtive, desperate haste, as hands worked to sever the crucial tension ropes. It was Phelan, the disgraced captain, his face a mask of bitter resolve. The easy path, the path of vengeance, was clear. One shout would bring guards, and the elf would be cut down as a saboteur. The old grievance burned in Odor's chest, a reminder of the public shame this very elf had once heaped upon him. But he also remembered the lesson learned in blood on the Dagorlad, the sight of elves charging to their deaths to save his own countrymen. He moved not with a cry, but with a quiet, decisive speed. He did not draw his blade. He simply stepped from the shadows and locked his arms around Phelan, pinning him against the cold wood of the war machine. The struggle was brief and fierce. Phelan fought with a frantic, cornered strength, his eyes wide not with malice, but with a fanatical despair. "You see only their clumsy noise," he hissed, his voice cracking. "You do not see how they dilute our glory, how they make our ancient strength a servant to their fleeting lives. This is not an alliance, it is a surrender. Odor did not argue. He simply held on, his own strength, forged in the harsh lands of the north, until the fight went out of the elf. He did not bind him with ropes, but with a quiet question. Is this the legacy you wish to leave, Phelan, to be remembered as the one who broke the last hope of Middle-earth for a ghost of pride? He marched the subdued elf not to a stockade, but directly to the command tent, where Gil-galad and Elendil stood over their maps of despair. The air turned to ice. The evidence was undeniable. The consequences of the sabotage would have been catastrophic. The law of any army demanded execution. But Odor stood before the two kings, his own past conflict with Phelan known to all, and spoke not as an accuser, but as an advocate. "My lords," he began, his voice rough but clear, "if we kill him, we prove his fear right. We prove that our unity is a thin veil over old hatreds. His action was born from a poison that preys on isolation. Let his healing be born from the mercy he believes we cannot possess. To spare him is a greater weapon against the Dark Lord than any sword we could forge." The gamble was breathtaking. Elendil, whose men would have died in the failed assault, looked to Gil-galad. The Elven King's face was stone, but in his eyes was a profound sorrow. He saw not just a traitor, but a faithful servant, twisted by grief and the lingering whispers of the enemy. He nodded. Phelan, standing shamed and broken, heard the verdict not of death, but of penance. The weight of Odor's mercy, a mercy from the very race he had scorned, shattered the last of his pride. He fell to one knee, not before the kings, but before the human sentry. "My life is yours," he vowed, his voice thick with a new and terrible clarity. "I will spend it in atonement, or I will spend it in death, but I will do so fighting for the alliance I sought to betray." In that moment, the alliance did not just survive another crisis. It evolved. It grew a soul. It proved it could not only withstand external blows, but could also heal the sickness within its own heart, forging a loyalty more powerful than any oath sworn under the stars. A jagged crack appeared in the black stone of the outer wall, a wound torn open by years of pressure and the desperate work of sappers. A roar went up from the army, a sound of release and terror combined. This was the moment they had bled for, the single chance they would ever get. And in that moment, the two High Kings made a choice that silenced the entire host. They would not command from the rear. Gil-galad took up his spear eglos, its point catching the foul light. Elendil drew his great sword Narsil, its blade gleaming with a cold fire. They would lead the assault themselves. To see their leaders, the twin pillars of this 7-year struggle, stride toward that breach, was a sight that broke the weariness from every soul. Elves and men who had forgotten the reason for their fight remembered it then, in the silent, terrible resolve on those two faces. They were not just kings, they were the living heart of the alliance, walking into the mouth of darkness. The charge that followed was not a disciplined advance. It was a tidal wave of silver and steel, a raw, screaming surge of hope and fury, all crashing toward that single, dark opening. Gil-galad and Elendil were the spear point, their personal guards a wall of flesh around them, fighting not to conquer, but to simply keep their kings alive long enough to reach the source of all this evil. The breach was a slaughterhouse, a narrow funnel of death where orcs and trolls were packed so thickly that the very air was weaponized, but the wave did not break. It pushed forward, inch by bloody inch, driven by the two figures at its front. They fought as one being, Gil-galad's spear a darting flame that found every gap in the enemy's defense. Elendil's sword a sweeping arc of ruin that shattered shields and bones alike. Their styles, so different on the training ground, were perfectly complementary in this hell, a deadly dance that had been 7 years in the making. To see them fight together was to see the alliance itself in motion, a perfect, brutal harmony. They crossed the threshold into the inner courtyard, a place no living thing of the free peoples had seen in an age. And there, the shadow gathered. The air itself grew thick and heavy, resisting their every step. The lesser orcs fell back, their eyes wide with a fear greater than that of blades. From the deepest darkness at the base of the tower, a form began to take shape. It was not a body of flesh, but a manifestation of pure malice and will, a being of shadow and flame, so terrible that the bravest warriors faltered. This was Sauron, the Dark Lord, come to defend his home. He held no sword, no spear. His power was the weapon, a palpable force that sought to crush their hope and their very souls. The two kings stood alone before him, their army held at bay by the sheer terror of his presence. The fate of every sunrise, every forest, every free breath in Middle-earth, now narrowed to this single point of conflict, a battle not just for a fortress, but for the very nature of the world to come. The very air screamed as Sauron's power washed over them. His form, a maelstrom of shadow and flame, made a mockery of mortal combat. Gil-galad's spear, Eglos, darted forward, a needle of starlight against an ocean of night. But the heat that radiated from the Dark Lord was a furnace that seared the Elven King's hands, the wood of his legendary weapon beginning to smolder. Beside him, Elendil brought Narsil down in a mighty arc, a blow that could have felled a tower, but it met an invisible wall of force that shattered his great shield into splinters and flung him backward onto the stone. The hope of the alliance seemed to die in that single, devastating moment. Sauron's attention turned fully to Gil-galad, whose spear now cracked, its light flickering. A hand of pure terror reached for the High King's throat, a touch that meant not just death, but utter annihilation. It was then that Elendil, his body broken and his armor scorched, made his final choice. He would not rise to strike another blow. With the last of his strength, the King of Men threw himself forward, placing his own dying form as a living shield between the Dark Lord and his elven brother. The sacrifice was absolute. Sauron's burning gaze fell upon him, a concentration of malice that consumed the last of Elendil's life in an instant. But that one, selfless act bought a single, priceless heartbeat. Freed from the full force of the assault, Gil-galad ignored his own agony, ignored the fire consuming him, and with a cry that held the light of the first dawn, he drove the shattered haft of Eglos deep into the shadowy form before him. It was not a killing blow, but it was a wound, a piercing of the Dark Lord's incarnate will that made him stagger, his terrible power faltering for the first time. The cost was everything. Both High Kings lay still upon the threshold of the Dark Tower, their lives spent not in a quest for glory, but in a final, perfect act of unity. One had given his mortality, the other his immortality, and in that shared sacrifice, they achieved what neither could have alone. They had brought the shadow to its knees. The shadow of Sauron lay broken upon the ground, a smoldering ruin of will and malice. Isildur stood over the prone form, his breath ragged, the shard of his father's sword Narsil cold and heavy in his hand. The air itself seemed to shudder, and from the Dark Lord's fallen hand, a single golden band slid free. It did not clatter on the stone, but landed with a soft, almost living weight. In that heartbeat, the world narrowed to a single, terrible point of choice. The ring did not speak in words, but in visions that bloomed in his mind like poison flowers. He saw his father, Elendil, not broken and lifeless, but restored, his crown bright upon his head. He saw the kingdom of Arnor rising in glory, its power so great that no shadow would ever dare touch it again. It promised him the strength to heal all the pain, to erase the 7 years of blood and sacrifice in a single, everlasting moment of triumph. The temptation was a physical ache, a siren call that drowned out the distant sounds of the crumbling tower and the cries of the wounded. Vengeance and grief coiled in his heart, a furious storm demanding a prize for such a catastrophic loss. This was not mere treasure, it Wergild, a blood price owed for his father's life. His hand tightened on the hilt of the broken sword. This was not a decision made in cold logic, but in the white-hot fire of personal tragedy. He brought the shard of Narsil down, not on the ring, but on the finger that bore it, severing the last physical connection between Sauron and his power. The Dark Lord's form dissolved into a wisp of shrieking shadow, utterly vanquished. But as Isildur stood there, the ring warm in his palm, Elrond was at his side, his voice urgent, cutting through the ringing in his ears. Cast it into the fire, Isildur, he pleaded, his eyes filled with a dread that spanned ages. Destroy it. This is not a prize to be won. It is a poison that will undo all we have achieved. Look at the cost. Your father, my king. Do not let their sacrifice be for nothing. Isildur looked from the wisdom in Elrond's face to the golden circle in his hand. He saw the promise of a future free from fear, a power to ensure no king would ever have to fall again. He closed his fingers over it. I will not destroy it, he said, his voice hollow with exhaustion and conviction. This is my Wergild, the price for my father. I will use it to mend the world he died to save. In that moment of terrible, understandable choice, a shadow longer than any Sauron had cast fell across the future. The victory was complete, but it was no longer pure. The seed of a far greater conflict was claimed not as a spoil of war, but as a son's bitter inheritance. The silence after the battle was a heavier burden than the fighting. Across the scorched plain of Dagorlad, the grim work of counting the cost began. There was no cheering, only the low murmur of healers and the soft, terrible sound of weeping that knew no race. For the first time, they did not separate their honored dead. A single great mound was raised, and within it, an elven lord who had seen the light of the two trees lay side by side with a farmer from the Vales of Anduin who had taken up a sword. This shared barrow was more than a grave. It was the final, unbreakable testament to their oath, a monument to the price of unity, written not in stone, but in common sacrifice. Elrond, his own heart scarred by the loss of his king, moved through this landscape of sorrow. He found Isildur standing alone before the simple cairn of his father and brother, the weight of a broken sword and a new, terrible burden upon his shoulders. The young king was now the last hope of his people, adrift in a world his father had helped save, but would never see. It was then that Elrond remembered Elendil's final wish, spoken not as a command, but as a father's plea in the quiet of their camp, to see his sons build a kingdom that would stand as a bastion against the long night. The easy path for Elrond was to lead his people back to the undying lands of the West, to heal their own ancient wounds far from the troubles of mortal men. But to do so would render every sacrifice meaningless. His decision was made not out of duty, but out of a bond forged in fire. He would not abandon Isildur. He would journey south with the surviving host of men to the very borders of Mordor itself, and there, on the slopes of Mount Mindilluin, he would lend his wisdom and his strength to raise the White City of Minas Anor, the first stronghold of the new realm of Gondor. This commitment transformed the alliance from a military compact into a living legacy. It meant the fate of the elves would remain tied to the fate of men for generations to come. As the great hosts turned westward, their journey home was a slow, sorrowful procession. The elves sang songs of lament for the lost, their voices a haunting melody that spoke of ages without end. The men marched in a silence that held all the grief of their shorter, brighter lives. They had won the war, but they carried the shadow of its price with them, a bittersweet victory that would echo through every stone of the cities they would build and every choice their heirs would ever make. The last campfire on the borders of the elven lands guttered out in the gray dawn. For a final time, the banners of the Eldar and the Dunedain stood side by side, but the air was no longer filled with the clamor of preparation. A profound silence fell as the two hosts turned to face one another across the dew-laden grass. There were no grand speeches. Instead, a single, resonant action swept through the ranks. As one, every elven warrior raised a hand to their heart in a solemn, ancient salute. And as one, every soldier of men returned the gesture, a quiet thunder of gauntlets striking chest plates. It was a language beyond words, a final testament to the brotherhood, carved from 7 years of shared suffering and sacrifice. They had faced the end of the world together, and now they were parting, the peace they had won feeling as heavy as the war itself. Elrond approached Isildur, the young king's face still etched with the fresh grief of his loss. In his hands, Elrond carried a small, carefully wrapped bundle. He unwound the cloth to reveal a sapling, its leaves a pale, shimmering silver, seeming to hold a light of its own, even in the dim morning. "This is a scion of Nimloth, the white tree of Numenor," he said, his voice low. "It is the tree of your kings, the symbol of your line. Let its roots grip the stone of your new city, and let its blossoms be a reminder that from the deepest shadows, life and hope can grow again." The gift was far more than a plant. It was a living memory, a piece of the elven world entrusted to the care of men, a direct and living link to the alliance they had forged. Its survival would become a barometer for the health of the new kingdom, a silent, growing promise in the court of the king. As the sun finally broke above the horizon, the long column of elves began to move, their steps light and soundless on the earth. They did not look back, their path set toward the gray havens and the sea longing that called them home. The men stood and watched them go, a wall of weathered faces and battered armor, until the last glint of silver had vanished into the western woods. The field was suddenly, starkly empty. A new chapter for Middle-earth had truly begun, but it was a world forever altered. The Age of Elves was waning, and the dominion of men was rising from the ashes of a victory that felt more like a farewell. The Great Alliance was now a memory, a story to be told, and a hope to be nurtured in the fragile soil of a world left in their care. The ring felt heavier than any crown. Isildur sat upon the throne in the great hall of Osgiliath, the murmur of his prosperous court, a distant hum. He dispensed justice with a clear voice and a steady hand, his judgments praised for their wisdom. Yet beneath the robes of state, a secret gnawed at him, a cold weight against his chest where the golden band lay hidden. Every decision was made twice, once by the king and once by the thing in his pocket, a silent partner that whispered of easier, swifter paths to peace. He had built a realm of splendor from the ashes of war, but the very artifact that promised him the strength to do so now built a wall of silent isolation between him and every subject, every counselor, even his own sons. He was a king ruling in sunlight, haunted by a shadow only he could see. This internal schism led to a fateful decree. He announced his intention to journey north, to return to his ancestral kingdom of Arnor, and consolidate his rule over all the Dunedain. His council was aghast. The roads were long and perilous, still haunted by remnants of the enemy, they argued. The realm needed its king here, in its new, glittering capital. But their logic could not penetrate the private turmoil in his heart. He felt a pull, a need to walk in the lands of his fathers, to escape the gilded cage of a city, built under the ever-watchful shadow of Mordor. It was a choice born of a burden he could confess to no one, a journey he felt compelled to make not just as a king, but as a man fleeing a ghost. He dismissed their concerns, his will absolute. As his small retinue made ready, a deeper shadow stirred in the wild places of the world. The orcs, once leaderless and scattered, were beginning to heed a new, hateful call, a whispered summons from the void that yearned for its master's treasure. The king rode out from his safe city, carrying the greatest danger in Middle-earth, not in a guarded vault, but in a simple leather pouch, setting a fragile lineage on a collision course with the reawakening hunger of the dark. The river Anduin ran cold and swift beneath a shrouded moon. Isildur's company, a proud column of Dunedain, marched along its eastern bank, their journey north a somber procession through lands still scarred by the recent war. They were veterans all, their armor bearing the dents of Dagorlad, their hearts heavy with the memory of lost kings. The peace they traveled through felt fragile, a thin veneer over a world that had not yet forgotten how to bleed. It was in this tense quiet that the ambush erupted, not with a warning cry, but with a sudden, deafening roar as hundreds of orcs poured from the dark woods, their crude scimitars glinting in the fragmented light. The Gladden fields, a place of gentle reeds and flowing water, became a slaughterhouse in an instant. The disciplined ranks of men tightened into a shield wall, a desperate island in a raging Black Sea. Isildur fought at their center, the Shard of Narsil in his hand, but his mind was not on the broken sword. With every parried blow, every fallen soldier, the cold weight against his chest seemed to pulse, whispering promises of dominion and survival. He felt its pull, a seductive current telling him that he need not struggle, that he need only claim its power, and this entire host would flee before him like chaff in the wind. In a moment of sheer desperation, as his guard was cut down around him, he gave in. He reached for the ring, slipping the golden band onto his finger, expecting to become a wraith of terrible power, a commander of fear. But the ring had a will of its own, a malice that remembered its true master. Instead of granting him strength, It betrayed him. At the very instant he needed its power most, it chose to slip from his finger, falling away into the mud and blood at his feet. The world snapped back into focus with brutal clarity. He was just a man again, visible and vulnerable, the orcs turning their hungry eyes directly toward him. The artifact he had trusted to save his life had instead delivered him to his enemies. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. With the ring lost in the chaos, his only thought was flight. He turned from the fray, his kingly pride forgotten, and plunged into the icy, churning waters of the Anduin. He was a strong swimmer, and for a few desperate heartbeats, the river seemed like a safer path than the blood-soaked field. He trusted the current to carry him away from the certain death behind him, but the orcs on the bank had seen him, and they hated the air of Elendil more than they feared the water. A volley of black arrows hissed across the surface of the river. One found its mark, then another. Isildur's strength fled him, the cold water filling his lungs as the life fled his body. The last direct heir of the last alliance, the man who held the legacy of both Elendil and Gil-galad in his trust, sank beneath the dark water, his great lineage and his terrible secret extinguished together. His personal conflict was resolved, but at a cost that would haunt the world for ages. The One Ring, the very heart of the enemy they had sacrificed so much to defeat, was not destroyed. It was merely lost, waiting in the murky depths of the river for a new hand to find it, and with its loss, the brightest hope of that great alliance faded into a dangerous, forgotten myth. The news of Isildur's fall reached Rivendell on a chill wind, a whisper of ruin carried by a lone, weary rider. In the hushed tranquility of his halls, where the waterfalls sang an endless, soothing song, Elrond stood perfectly still as the report was given. The messenger departed, leaving behind a silence more profound than any sound. Elrond did not cry out. He did not summon his council. Instead, he walked to a small, secluded alcove overlooking the Bruinen, and with a hand that did not tremble, he lit a single white candle. The small flame flickered, a fragile defiance against the gathering twilight. This was not a public memorial, but a private reckoning with a ghost. His mind returned, as it had 1,000 times, to the scorching heat at the crack of doom, to Isildur's weary, defiant face. The words he had spoken there now echoed with the hollow ring of failure. Had his counsel been too polite, too respectful of a king's grief? Should he, who had seen the depths of Sauron's deceit, have drawn his own sword and forced the issue, regardless of the consequence? The thought was a shard of ice in his heart. He had prioritized diplomacy over necessity, and in doing so, he had allowed the very heart of the enemy to slip back into the world. The victory of the last alliance, bought with the blood of 2 high kings, was now tainted, its ultimate purpose unfulfilled. From this deep well of grief and responsibility, a new resolve was forged, cold and hard as mithril. He would not let their sacrifice be rendered meaningless by the passage of time. The Dunedain, the people of the West, were now a scattered and leaderless people, their king lost, their hope fading. They needed a sanctuary, a place where their lore, their bloodline, and their purpose could be preserved against the long, slow decay of the world. His decision was a monumental shift in his own eternal life. Rivendell would become more than a haven for elves. It would be a fortress of memory, a living archive for the legacy of Numenor. He would become the steward of a story that men themselves might forget, the silent guardian of a broken sword and a failed promise. This was no small commitment. It meant binding his own fate and the fate of his household to the turbulent, fleeting lives of mortals for ages to come. He looked into the candle's flame, and in its light, he made a vow that would span 3,000 years. He would watch over the heirs of Isildur, however diminished they might become. He would wait with the patience of the mountains until the world turned enough that the ring, the great and terrible poison, was found once more. For only when it re-emerged from the shadows would there be a final, fleeting chance to correct the catastrophic mistake at the root of their hard-won peace. That single white candle in Rivendell became a beacon for a new kind of war. Elrond's grief did not curdle into isolation, but instead crystallized into a profound sense of duty. He understood that the shadow had been defeated, not destroyed, and that its return was a matter of when, not if. From this understanding, a quiet, monumental project was born. He began to summon the wisest and most powerful beings left in Middle-earth, not to a grand army, but to a council. This was not a council of kings, but of lore masters, healers, and wanderers. To his halls came Círdan the shipwright from the Grey Havens, who held the memory of the sea, and the Lady Galadriel of Lorien, whose mirror saw things that were, and things that yet might be. Even the reclusive wizards, those mysterious figures who had come from across the sea, would in time lend their counsel. This gathering, which would become known as the Council of the Wise, was Elrond's masterstroke. It was a network of vigilance, a web of knowledge spun across the vastness of Middle-earth, designed to watch for the faintest stirrings of the old darkness. Its first and greatest task was to gather every fragment of lore, every whispered rumor, every forgotten scroll that spoke of the One Ring and the lingering evils Sauron had left behind like poisoned seeds in the soil. This slow, patient accumulation of knowledge was their only weapon against a foe who had all of time to wait. Yet this great work immediately presented a terrible dilemma. How much of this grim truth should be shared with the world? Elrond made a fateful choice. The full, terrifying knowledge of the ring's survival and its corrupting nature would be kept secret, a burden borne only by the council itself. He reasoned that to reveal this to the free peoples, to the hobbits of the Shire, or the men of Dale, would be to sow a panic that could cripple the world's recovery. Despair, he believed, was a weapon as potent as any orc legion, but this policy of secrecy came at a steep cost. It concentrated an immense, lonely responsibility into the hands of a very few. It created a gulf of understanding between the guardians and the guarded. A farmer in Rohan might live his entire life in peace, never knowing that his safety was purchased by the silent, endless watch of beings he would never meet. This conflict between the need for preparedness and the fear of causing despair would define the long years that followed. The council became the memory of Middle-earth, a living archive of a danger the world was trying to forget. And so began the Long Watch, a patient, centuries-spanning vigil against a shadow that had only retreated, waiting for a single golden mistake to be found. The sapling from Elrond did not flourish as the poets had foretold. In the high courtyard of Minas Anor, the white tree of Gondor began to sicken. Its silver leaves, once vibrant with a captured light, grew brittle and pale, falling like forgotten promises onto the white stone. This was no simple blight, no failure of soil or season. The tree's decline was a physical echo of a spiritual malady, a slow withering that mirrored the fading memory of the Great Alliance and the waning strength of the Dunedain themselves. How could a kingdom, built upon the very idea of vigilance, maintain its watch when the reason for that watch was becoming a dusty legend? The sight of the dying tree ignited a fierce debate within the Council of the Stewards. One faction, led by the stern steward Baragond, saw it as a final, grim omen. The line of Elendil is broken, he argued, his voice echoing in the vaulted chamber. The tree dies because the true king is gone. To cling to this dead symbol is to live in a dream. We must uproot it, plant something new, and forge our own destiny, free from the shadow of a broken oath. His words were practical, born of a desire to look forward, but they carried the cold scent of surrender. Against him stood the steward Syrian, an older man whose eyes still held the light of the stories his grandfather had told him. You speak of moving forward, Baragond, but you would have us tear out our very roots, Syrian countered, his tone quiet but unyielding. This tree is not just a plant. It is a witness. It is a reminder of the price that was paid, of the alliance that saved the world. To remove it is to say that sacrifice no longer matters. The dead tree is a warning, yes, but it is also a hope. It tells us that a day may yet come when it blooms again. The argument was about more than horticulture. It was a conflict over the soul of Gondor itself, a struggle between accepting a diminished reality and holding fast to a nearly extinguished hope. The ruling steward, a man named Icthelion, listened to both sides in a heavy silence. He knew Baragond's logic was sound, and the temptation to sweep away this painful reminder was powerful. Yet his heart sided with Syrian's stubborn faith. His decision, when it came, would define his rule. He decreed that the tree would remain. It would stand in the courtyard, its bare branches a stark silhouette against the sky, neither removed nor replaced. It would be preserved exactly as it was, a monument to a promise not yet fulfilled. This was not an act of mere sentimentality. It was a declaration. Gondor would not forget. It would live in the tension between its present reality and its legendary past. Its glory dimmed, but its heart still true, waiting in the long twilight for a king who might one day bring the spring. While the white tree stood as a public monument to faded glory, a more private and potent symbol was carefully preserved in the quiet halls of Rivendell. The Shards of Narsil, the very sword that had shattered against Sauron's will, were not merely stored as a relic of a tragic past. Elrond ordered his most skilled smiths to clean the broken steel, to anoint the fragments with oils that would prevent the faintest speck of rust, and to lay them upon a velvet cloth in a place of honor. This was not an act of mourning, but one of active, patient hope. Every time a smith's hand touched those cold shards, they were not handling a piece of history. They were preparing for a future that had not yet arrived. The sword's presence was a constant, silent question in the heart of the last homely house, a question about the nature of kingship itself. What truly makes a king? Is it a bloodline, a crown, or is it the willingness to pick up a broken tool and make it whole again? By keeping Narsil ready, Elrond was betting on the latter, maintaining a thread of light through the long, dimming years. This quiet work held immense stakes. The sword was the physical proof of the oath sworn between Gil-galad and Elendil, a bond that had cost both their lives. To reforge it would be to declare that the alliance itself was not a forgotten story, but a living promise waiting to be renewed. It meant that Elrond believed, against all evidence of a world grown weary and forgetful, that an heir would one day emerge who was worthy of both its blade and its legacy. And so the shards waited, a glittering, fractured promise on its cushion, a testament to the faith that the most profound breaks can, with the right hands and the right fire, be made stronger than they ever were before. The last homely house stood as a sanctuary of memory, its very stones humming with ancient wisdom. Elrond's mastery turned Rivendell into more than a refuge. It became a living library for the free peoples, a bastion where the light of the elder days was carefully preserved against the world's growing dimness. Yet this sanctuary was also a target. The enemy's minions, from skulking orcs to more subtle spirits of shadow, constantly probed its borders, drawn by the potent artifacts and profound knowledge gathered there. Every patrol of elven guards along the high passes, every shimmer of the valley's protective enchantments, was a quiet battle in a war of preservation. This was the delicate balance Elrond maintained, a life spent defending a pocket of peace in a world forever tilting toward conflict. Within this haven of peril and grace, he made a choice that would define his most personal war. He raised his daughter, Arwen, not solely within the timeless songs of the elves, but with a deep and abiding love for the mortal world of her mother. He taught her the beauty of a sunrise that would one day be her last, the profound courage in a human life lived brightly against the certainty of its end. This was not merely a father's lesson, it was a deliberate shaping of her heart, an echo of the choice he himself had made centuries before to bind his fate to that of mortal men. He gave her the very tools that would one day allow her to face the same agonizing decision he had witnessed at the crack of doom, a choice between an undying life of memory and a mortal life of fleeting, precious love. In nurturing this duality, Elrond forged a chain that linked his own heart directly to the future of both kindreds. The stakes were no longer just the fate of kingdoms or rings of power, but the destiny of his own child, a living bridge between two worlds whose choice would either validate his lifelong sacrifice or shatter his immortal heart forever. The first whisper arrived not as a shout, but as a chill in the air. A traveler from the wild lands beyond the misty mountains spoke of a shadow creeping through the great forest of Mirkwood, of a place the locals now called Dol Guldur, the Hill of Sorcery. They told of a nameless fear that stalked the woods, and of a mysterious necromancer who dwelt there, summoning the dead and twisting the living into monstrous forms. To most, it was just another dark tale from the wilderness, but in the quiet halls of Rivendell, Elrond heard the echo of a far more terrible name. This was no random evil. It was a pattern, a subtle, probing action, the first sign of a shadow pooling its strength once more. The long watch was over, the enemy was moving. This grim certainty forced his hand. He sent out the call, summoning the White Council from their far-flung duties. The Alliance of the Wise, forged in the aftermath of the last alliance, would now face its first true test. They gathered in a sunlit glade of Rivendell, a stark contrast to the dark news they had to discuss. The debate that followed was sharp and divided. Saruman the White, the head of their order, counseled a policy of watchful patience. The ring is lost, he argued, his voice resonating with a power that demanded attention. Without it, Sauron cannot take a permanent form. This necromancer is a lesser spirit, a distraction. To move against him openly is to reveal our own strength and our own fear. It is a risk we cannot afford. His logic was cold, precise, and to many, it seemed the safer path. But Elrond saw the deeper danger. Waiting is the weapon he counts on, Elrond countered, his gaze sweeping across the council. It gives his shadow time to grow, to poison the roots of the world while we sit in council. Every day we delay, his web of fear grows stronger. This is not a distraction. It is the first move in a new war. To ignore it is to repeat the mistake of Isildur, to hope a danger will simply vanish if we look away. His argument was not just one of strategy, but of moral necessity, a refusal to let the sacrifices of the past be forgotten through inaction. The council was torn. Yet, Elrond's unwavering vigilance, born from centuries of bearing the weight of that ancient failure, carried the day. He convinced them to act. A party was dispatched to the dark fortress of Dol Guldur, not an army, but a probing strike of wisdom and power. It was the beginning of a new, more subtle chapter in the long war, a declaration that the free peoples would not wait passively for the storm to break, but would meet the gathering shadow on its own threshold. A dragon's greed can reshape the map of the world. Far to the north, the great worm Smaug lay coiled upon a stolen mountain of gold, his very presence, a corruption that weakened the land. His desolation of the lonely mountain had left a power vacuum, a wound in the north that the growing shadow in Mirkwood was all too eager to fill. Gandalf the Grey, ever the wandering guardian, saw the threads of this looming catastrophe. He understood that a dragon was more than a beast. It was a weapon of immense and unpredictable power. Should Sauron ever bend that weapon to his will, the forces of the free peoples would be caught between the hammer of Mordor and the anvil of a fire drake. This was no isolated adventure. It was a strategic move in a war most did not yet know had begun. And so, he sought out a proud, bitter dwarf king in exile, Thorin Oakenshield, and set in motion a quest that seemed, on its surface, to be about gold and a lost homeland. But its true purpose was to deny the enemy, a northern ally, to secure a flank in a battle that was still gathering its armies. To ensure this desperate plan had any hope, Gandalf needed a sanctuary of wisdom and a keeper of ancient secrets. He led Thorin and his unlikely company, which now included a very reluctant hobbit named Bilbo Baggins, to the one place in Middle-earth where the memory of such dangers was still vividly alive. Elrond's welcome in Rivendell was not given lightly. He looked upon these dwarves, their hearts burning with a thirst for revenge, and saw the fragile thread upon which so much now depended. His decision to grant them counsel and safe passage was a deliberate act of intervention. He was not merely aiding a group of wanderers, he was reinforcing a critical defensive line in a war of shadows. The moment of true revelation came under the cool starlight in his courtyard. He took their map, a faded heirloom of lost glory, and held it aloft. The gentle light of the moon, filtered through a silver-edged cloud, fell upon the parchment. And there, as if written by the memory of starlight itself, faint letters appeared that no dwarven eye had ever seen. Moon letters, he read, the hidden script of my kin. Stand by the gray stone when the thrush knocks, and the setting sun with the last light of Durin's day will shine upon the keyhole. This was not a simple translation. It was the gift of a chance, a crucial piece of lore that that turned an impossible dream into a precarious possibility. By providing this key, Elrond did more than help them find a door. He helped ensure that the stone of Erebor would not become a jewel in the Dark Lord's crown. The fate of a hobbit, a company of dwarves, and a lonely mountain was now inextricably braided into the fate of all the West. A single, humble thread pulled tight in the vast tapestry of the coming war. A simple game of riddles in the dark sealed the fate of the world. Deep in the caves beneath the misty mountains, a lost and frightened hobbit named Bilbo Baggins stretched out his hand in the blackness, his fingers closing not around a stone, but around a cold, metallic circle. He had no thought of ancient alliances or dark lords, only of survival and the strange, slippery creature he was trying to outwit. When he slipped the ring onto his finger and vanished from sight, it felt like a marvelous piece of luck, a clever trick that saved his life. He did not feel the eye of Sauron turn in its deep slumber, sensing a long-lost part of its own soul stirring back into the world after 2,500 years. Bilbo's decision to pocket the ring and keep its existence a secret was not born of malice, but of a subtle, creeping possessiveness that the ring itself cultivated. It whispered to a quiet, comfortable part of his hobbit heart, convincing him that this was his own special secret, his precious. In that moment, the grand conflict between light and shadow was reduced to a single, terrible variable, a small golden band carried in the pocket of an unlikely and completely unaware bearer. The ring had chosen its path back into the world, not with a bang, but with a whisper, and the entire delicate balance of power, maintained for centuries by the vigilance of the wise, now depended entirely on the choices of one very small person. The golden band that Bilbo brought out of the dark was a ghost at the feast, a secret that poisoned the peace of Rivendell for decades. Its true nature could not remain hidden forever. The shadow in the east was growing bold, its servants scouring the lands for the one treasure that could restore their master to full power. When the Black Riders crossed the ford of Bruinen, their pursuit of the humble hobbit, Frodo Baggins, made it clear the time for quiet vigilance was over. Elrond had no choice but to act. He sent out summons, a call that echoed across mountains and through ancient forests, gathering the scattered heirs of the old alliance for a council that would decide the fate of the world. They came to the porches of Rivendell, these heirs of a faded glory. There was the dwarf Gimli, son of Gloin, his voice a rumble of old grievances and mountain pride. Beside him sat the elf Legolas of Mirkwood, his silence a wall of immortal grace. Boromir, a captain of Gondor, came seeking a weapon for his besieged city, his heart heavy with the despair of a long, losing war. And Aragorn, the hidden heir of Isildur himself, walked among them not as a king, but as a ranger of the wild, bearing the weight of a broken sword and a broken lineage. The council itself was a mirror of the deep divisions that had festered since the last alliance. Boromir spoke passionately of using the ring, of turning the enemy's own weapon against him to save his people from slaughter. His was the voice of desperate men who saw only the immediate threat of fire and sword. The dwarf and the elf, though ancient foes, both counseled keeping the ring safe, hidden away in some impregnable fastness, a plan that ignored the ring's corrupting will to be found. The debate raged, a storm of fear and pride, until the ring itself was brought forth and laid upon the pedestal. A shadow seemed to fall over the sunlit glade. In that moment of tense silence, it was the hobbit, Frodo, who spoke with a quiet courage that shamed the arguments of lords and warriors. He would take it, he said. He would take the ring to Mordor. The offer was so staggering, so seemingly foolish, that it silenced the council. Elrond looked upon the halfling, this small creature from a land of peace, and saw in his resolve the only path that had not been poisoned by the desire for power. To trust the fate of all Middle-earth to this one, fragile bearer, was a gamble that dwarfed any military strategy. It was a leap of faith, a decision to place their hope not in strength, but in innocence and resilience. From that moment of supreme trust, a new fellowship was forged. 9 walkers were chosen to oppose the 9 ringwraiths, a company representing the free peoples, a small, desperate echo of the great host that had marched on the Black Gate so long ago. As they prepared to depart, the weight of history pressed down upon them. They were not an army, but a secret, their quest a thread of hope so thin, it seemed it must surely break. The fate of the new alliance now rested on the shoulders of the least of its members, and on the enduring truth that courage is found not in the absence of fear, but in the choice to walk forward into the shadow regardless. The morning mist clung to the valley floor as the 9 walkers crossed the bridge from Rivendell, their footsteps the only sound in the waking world. This was no grand procession with banners flying, but a quiet departure into a gathering storm. Each member carried the weight of this choice, a burden that settled deepest on the shoulders of Aragorn. For him, this path was a return to the very source of his bloodline's sorrow, a walking back into the shadow that had consumed his ancestor. He carried not just a pack and a cloak, but the shattered legacy of Isildur. The moment he accepted the quest, he was no longer a ranger of the wild, but the heir of Elendil, stepping onto a stage set millennia before his birth. His decision to guide them was the first true act of his kingship, a quiet embrace of a destiny he had spent a lifetime fleeing, and in his hand he carried the proof, a blade that was both a promise and a warning. The sword that was broken now shone whole again, its steel gleaming with a captured light, its new name, Anduril, a whisper of flame and hope. To see it unsheathed was to see the last alliance itself walking with them, a ghost of silver and steel, haunting their every step through the wild. This was no longer just a quest to destroy a ring. It was a test of whether the old oath could finally be fulfilled, whether the long failure of the past could be redeemed by the courage of the present. As the woods closed in behind them, the legacy of 2 high kings became the silent 10th member of their company, a memory of sacrifice that asked for one more. The air in the chamber was a physical weight, thick with heat and the deafening roar of the mountain's heart. Frodo Baggins stood at the very edge of the crack of doom, the one ring a burning brand in his hand. In that final, terrible moment, the whispers of the ring became a single, undeniable command, drowning out the memory of the Shire, the voice of Samwise, and the ghostly echoes of every sacrifice made to bring him here. The courage of Gil-galad, the fall of Elendil, the long watch of Elrond, the blood spilled on the Dagorlad, all of it converged on this small hobbit, the weight of ages pressing down upon his soul. And he broke. The ring had done its work. He turned, his face transformed by a power and a greed that were not his own, and he claimed it. "I have come," he declared, his voice a stranger's. "But I do not choose now to do what I came to do. I will not do this deed. The ring is mine, It was the ultimate failure, the tragic flaw in the plan of the wise, the final victory of the shadow. But the story of the ring was always a tale of unintended consequences, of small hands altering great designs. From the shadows, a creature driven by a lust more ancient and more personal than any Dark Lord's ambition, launched himself. Gollum, a pitiable soul forged and broken by this same golden band, seized his precious from Frodo's finger. For a single, exultant moment, he danced upon the precipice, his prize regained. Then he fell. The shriek that tore from his throat was not of terror, but of a loss so profound it consumed him even as the fire did. The ring fell with him, a flash of gold swallowed by the raging inferno. A shockwave of pure silence erupted from the mountain, a void that sucked the sound from the world before the very foundations of Barad-dûr crumbled into dust. The Dark Lord Sauron, his power bound to the fate of his ring, dissolved into a wailing nothingness, his will scattering on the wind like ash. The war was over. The great goal of the last alliance, the purpose for which two high kings had given their lives and a world had held its breath for 3,000 years, was finally, completely, and unexpectedly fulfilled. It was not the strength of kings or the wisdom of elves that achieved it, but the desperate, corrupted love of a ruined creature, a final, chaotic act of grace that proved no plan, however wise, could account for the strange turns of the heart. The smallest people, in their frailties and their passions, had indeed changed everything. The new sapling's roots gripped the ancient soil of Minas Tirith, its silver leaves shimmering in the sun as a living echo of the gift Elrond had given Isildur so long ago. When Aragorn, now crowned King Elessar, placed it in the courtyard where the dead tree had stood, it was more than a ceremony. It was the closing of a circle that had remained broken for 3,000 years. This single act of planting was the final, peaceful consequence of that desperate alliance, a sign that the long rift between elves and men was healed at last. The tree was not just a symbol of a king's return. It was a promise that the sacrifices of the past could finally bear fruit in the present. With the shadow gone and the kingdoms of men reunited under a single, rightful ruler, a profound change settled over the world. The Age of Elves, which had stretched back to the dawn of time, was now gracefully, inevitably, drawing to a close. In the quiet halls of Rivendell, Elrond felt this shift not as a loss, but as a release. His long vigil was over. The air he had guarded, the sword he had preserved, the hope he had nurtured, all had reached their fulfillment. The work of the last alliance was complete. His choice to sail into the west was not an escape, but the earned rest of a guardian who had finally shepherded his charge safely home. As his ship passed into the mists, the memory of Gil-galad and Elendil did not fade. It was woven into the very foundations of the new age, a timeless lesson written not in grand monuments, but in the simple, enduring truth that light prevails when free peoples choose to stand together, no matter the cost.